Hello, and welcome to part 2 of 4 of the Fairey story, Long Patrol. As always, if you do like these videos, please do like. Please perhaps consider sharing on social media. It's always nice to have more people come along. Subscribe, of course, or there's a little bell down there if you fancy it. There's also Discord and Patreon if you're feeling really kind and generous. Patreon goes towards principally my book purchasing, which is, well, other people have hobbies which they purchase, which are probably not as expensive. Honestly, I honestly think sometimes rock climbing or maybe, even skydiving would be cheaper than a book habit. But no, I have a book habit, and I love it. And it helps for things like this. I also have a new office coming at some point, in the garden, which I will need to put in shelving. Lots and lots of shelving. But that's all for another day. So, post-World War I, what did the interwar fairies get up to? What did they do? Well, so many companies do not survive the end of World War I. Think of the most famous example, Sopwith. Sopwith, of course, does have its own story, and there are stories from what comes from Sopwith, and there are names which appear which, whilst not necessarily associated directly with the Sopwith, are the Sopwith continuing. That is not today's topic. Today's topic is Fairey. Now, I must admit, I've taken a slightly different tack with Fairey than I did with Blackburn. There is... Now, where was I? Ah, yes, I've taken a different approach with Blackburn, with Fairey, because, well, Fairey are a different company. It's kind of interesting in that Fairey, and you especially see this in the aircraft we're going to be talking about, to an extent, thanks to the connections that Richard Fairey has with various parts of the Air Ministry, almost start to produce the aircraft before there is a role for them. And some of their most successful aircraft actually first create the role and then turn into the aircraft we know about, really. Example, of course, comes out is the legacy of Fairey aircraft number 10. Now, as I mentioned, number 10 is the genus for what comes. Why is number 10 the genus? Because number 10 is this multi-seater, fairly large, but not too large, single-engined aircraft which can be in land plane or float plane configuration, reliable. What am I sort of describing here? It is an aircraft which is the genesis of spotter reconnaissance. It is that role, but it isn't called number 10 in that configuration. In fact, it's called the Fairey III, and they're used for spotter reconnaissance. So yes, this aircraft is the counterpart for this aircraft. Much famed on my channel. I'm still not quite sure why. Although, honestly, I'm going to leave it up there because I think there is an aircraft coming which rivals it in terms of aesthetic issues. Actually, I wonder if I could put that up above my head. Oh, it does fit. Hello. Now I'll put it down. It's more sensible down below. Just, yeah. So, the Fairey III. Now, I could read you the figures from this book, which is the Naval Institute Guide to Fairey. And it says, for land plane data, C, 3A, or B. It has a span of 46 feet, 2 inches, which is the same as the wingspan of the A. It has a length of 36 feet, which is slightly longer than the A, and actually a lot longer than the A, but a little bit longer still than the F. Anyone think you have to fit these in carriers and aboard ships? Height, 11 feet 10 inches. Again, taller than the A, shorter than the F. Overall wing area, 542 square feet. Exactly the same as the A. A fairly large amount more than the F. 100 more square feet than the F. Empty weight, 2,970 pounds. 440 pounds more than the A. Fully loaded weight, 4,159 pounds, which is a lot more than the A, but a lot less than the F. Engine is the same as the Fairey 3A. It is a Sunbeam Maori 2, which gives it a total of 260 horsepower. So next time anyone starts cracking on about the Swordfish, which is entered service to a 1933 specification, having an 825 power horsepower engine, think about this. In 1917 and 1918, that is 15 years earlier, a 260 horsepower engine is considered wonderful. That by the time the F comes into the service in the late 1930s, 1920s, actually, they are up to 570 horsepower. Woohoo! You've doubled it. 825 horsepower is cool, is very, very good. More importantly than that, you have to remember everything comes down to power to weight ratio. So how much does that engine, which is giving you 825 horsepower, weigh versus another engine which doesn't give you 800, which might give you slightly more? But does it weigh a lot more? Because power to weight ratio matters. Maximum speed of the Fairey 3A, 104 miles per hour at sea level. 120 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. Now that's the F, if I'm not mistaken, those figures. The figures for the A are 109 miles per hour at sea level, and the figures at 10,000 feet is 104 miles an hour. So, believe it or not, the Fairey III was faster than the F at sea level. It was slower than the F by a long way at 10,000 feet. Why does that matter? Because, again, that comes down to the choices you're making in engines and reliability. Why do you need slightly faster, long endurance at 10,000 feet? And why do you adjust your aircraft to be faster higher up than lower down? Well, if it's you're worried about its low down speed, that means you're thinking about it being an attacking aircraft. An aircraft at this time is going to be dropping its bombs, machine gunning, all those things from fairly low altitude. If you're worried about its high altitude speed, and 10,000 feet at this time is high altitude, 3 kilometers up, it's not bad going. Well, you're thinking about reconnaissance. You're thinking about spotting. That is what the Fairey III becomes. When it starts off, Fairey are talking about it being a patrol aircraft and all sorts of things. Some of them even think it could be a fighter. But there is no coincidence that once it really gets into its stride as a spotter, that's where its huge numbers come from. The Fairey 3D, the Fairey 3F, Marks 3 and Marks 4. 227, 291 and 243 aircraft, respectively. Or, to put this another way, if you take the 975 aircraft built in total under the Fairey III group, well, even if you take the 1,252, which include Gordons and Seals, those three types of the Fairey account for, wow, well, they account for 521 plus 247, 141 aircraft. Or, by my count, roughly 65%. You can correct my maths if you want. I am a historian. I do realize my maths go off sometimes. In simple terms, those three aircraft are the aircraft you will see if you're talking about a Fairey 3F or a Fairey 3 of any kind. Now, the Fairey 3's list of operators include Australia, Argentina, Canada, Chile, Egypt, Greece, Ireland, Netherlands, New Zealand, Portugal, Soviet Union, Sweden, and of course the UK, plus numerous other nations bought some to test them out. And this means, and this is going to get some people very excited, that they did serve in the Adriatic. In fact, quite often, the Royal Navy were using Fairey 3s to really extend presence in the Adriatic when the Italians were being very, very Mare Nostrum. Tweaking the tail a little bit. It's a funny thing to think about these days. When we're talking about freedom of the oceans and freedom of the seas and ship passages to explain, to emphasize that to nations which are perhaps building islands and setting down rules where there is no precedent for them to do so, and they're trying to use the old might is right. That justifies it. Or some very carefully rewriting of history. Which as a historian I appreciate, because it's what historians do all the time, rewrite history, to try and get it closer to the truth, usually, but also to try and make sure that history and its lessons are still in a relevant format and presented in a relevant way for that generation to understand. I'm not quite sure if what that particular nation is doing fits with either of those criteria, but more power to the historians. So, aircraft was still fairly new, and seaplanes had a lovely option in that they can land on the water. So you can fly them off your cruiser, and they can fly up the Adriatic, and they can land, and they can wander into, let's say, a harbour in Croatia or various other places. This is, of course, a modern map of that area, but it wasn't like that in the 1920s and 1930s, and sort of so neat. Or they can, if they really want to wind up the Italians, can land and motor in the last few miles on the water. Yeah, believe it or not, float along like they're a little boat on the calm sea, and pull into an Italian harbour and go, hello, we're just here to say hi, have lunch. It's rare that they do these things, and it's rare you find anyone but a very senior officer pulling such a stunt. But it's also the fact that these stunts were very effective at reminding people they could reach places. So your friendly local cruise would be one place, or friendly local seaplane would be the other. Now, of course, we can do similar things with helicopters. In fact, never let it be said that you cannot make a squad of Royal Marines look like you've landed an entire brigade with the judicious use of a couple of helicopters and a frigate popping round and Marines popping out of everywhere. You can do. The fact is though, it's a bluff. Like all these things, presence is a bluff. Okay? And the Fairey 3F was critical to, and the Fairey 3D were critical to perpetuating those bluffs. Because the reality is, when everyone knows this, the Royal Navy couldn't have all its force in one place at a time. So when you have books which start saying things like, I don't know, the Royal Navy's fallen to being a second or third rate power because in this ocean they weren't able to match ship for ship this other power, you go, well, that's because they were trying to match all these powers around the world and maintain a position all around the world. Trick is to have enough force present to remind them, A, that you have a lot more force elsewhere, and if things go hot, that force will be moved. Secondly, enough present that it means that they, both the other side, knows you're watching and knows you're interested. Aircraft like this allow you to maximize your presence, allow you to really highlight it. It's little ships like sloops and aircraft with such a seaplane, especially seaplanes, float planes, which really allow you to maximize your presence for peacetime, for deterring conflict. And it's one of those interesting scenarios you get in that, yes, we all know the land plane, as they're called, aircraft, which fly off carriers, are the best for fighting wars. They are. And we know helicopters are the best for anti-submarine operations and ease of ship operations. Operationally, those are the best things. But presence-wise, you could still argue that these aircraft, float planes, like this Fairey III, which is in Royal Canadian Air Force colours, float planes like that were pretty darn useful. It's the X Factor scenario. Yes? A Fairey III is something you can sit there and look at this type of engines and go, right then. A Fairey III has a 260 horsepower Sunbeam Maori 2. Fairey III has the same engine but has slight modifications. Fairey III has a 375 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle V12. A Rolls-Royce Eagle. Ooh. The Fairey 3D has either the Rolls-Royce Eagle or a 450 horsepower Napier Lion. Ah, just feel the power. Then a 3E. That's a Ferret radial engine. It's an interesting thing. It was an attempt to make it far more practical for the Far East, where, again, the inline engines and piston engines were proving quite difficult to maintain at long distance. They really were. The Fairey III then comes along, and they are mainly powered with the Napier Lion. Usually the 450 horsepower one, but some of them do get up to more than 450 horsepower. Ooh. Some of those engines are certified up to a dizzying 500 horsepower. Just imagine the power. They're good, though. There is even 3 of these aircraft, F variations. Good old variations on the Mark IV, which are converted to Queen, remote controlled. They're Queen Bees. And they are the flying targets which you practice your AA fire on. They fly level and straight and true. And you blast away at them. And then you go, ooh, we hit something. Sometimes we even hit it because our actual air defense systems have worked. It's when you realize things like that, like air defense drills in the 1920s and 30s, are kind of like bayonet drills. They're not necessarily about what they actually teach you. They're about giving you confidence in your systems so that you will use them properly in war. All sort of battles in Scotland during various Jacobite rebellions. And the British troops, which were mostly Scottish themselves, mostly Scottish, a vast majority were Scottish themselves in origin, but a fair number of English probably chucked in as well, were raised to fight, to protect, to fight off the Jacobins. Now, usually the Highlanders would charge do a musket volley and then charge with their claymores, shouting, screaming. The rebel yell had nothing on hundreds of men, big burly Highlanders in, let's be honest, kilts, which keep flicking up and down in the wind. It's just not a fun experience if you're facing it. You're not sure where you want to look. It's kind of like those school locker room shower scenario where everyone has their heads or eyes on the ceiling going, nope, not looking. You need confidence. You need confidence in your bayonet drill. The thing is, they teach them this technique, which is that they should do that against the person to their, to the other side of them, which is great, until you realize that the charging Highlanders do not arrive in line en masse. In fact, the odds of them coming up in a nightly line and you all being able to take the one to your left are very rare. And also, there's one is there's no one there, no one there, and this guy's coming towards you here. Are you going to wait for this guy next to you to deal with them, or are you going to think he's got a great big sword? I'm going to go through myself. That's what happens. But the thing is, in the first battles, they hadn't been taught. They hadn't had confidence that their bayonets would work. They'd tried to use the rifles, muskets as clubs and all sorts of things. They hadn't used the sharp, pointy bit on the end because they didn't have faith. After they'd been through the drills, they'd learned how strong it was. They'd learned its capabilities. So it didn't matter that the situation didn't fit their drill. What mattered was they had faith in it. And it's the same with the Fairey Queens. Although that does sound like I'm talking about something from the Cockney part of London. So, and I've left the Blackburn where it is, because despite it not being really relevant to the Fairey Pintail, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that I am thinking of compiling a book at some point of the most aesthetically displeasing aircraft of the interwar era. I have an Italian, I have no idea what to call it, but hotel with wings, which has about 8 wings in 2 sets of 4, or possibly 12 wings. I think it had 12 wings, actually. 3 sets of 4. Anyway, it looks like it's from the, I don't know, the wacky races. And I have the Blackburn, for obvious reasons, and the Fairey Pintail, because okay, here is the exact thing. The first entirely new post-war aircraft to be produced by Fairey was the Pintail, a fighter reconnaissance designed seaplane designed and built coincidentally with the Parnell Puffin to meet requirement for the IRS specification 21. For a 2-seat amphibian which could be operated to and from land or water and from carrier decks. Now, this aircraft disturbs me so much that I went and I got out the big book of specifications, and I went hunting for specification 21. And it was an interesting thing, because I realized it was specified for in 1919. First of all, I had to work out when 1919 comes in the book, because believe it or not, the book sort of picks up about 1920 with actual specification lists. Yes, because prior to that, they don't have the same system, which is interesting. But you work through it, and you go, right then, there is XX1. You start going through here. You have all the discussions of the preparation of military aircraft specifications. You have design requirements standards. You have the research aircraft standards. It has all sorts of really cool stuff in this book. And you realize It's listed here. Type XXI or 21, Fleet Reconnaissance. And your options are the Fairey Pintail or the Parnell Puffin. So let's look at the Parnell Puffin. We have now been joined by a puffin. I am not surprised that this particular project didn't produce any successful aircraft, in that neither type were taken into service, and surprise, surprise, it seems to be that the role was taken over by the 3F. So, well, the Fairey III. So, pretty much those aircraft, and that would evolve into that aircraft, were chosen, kept over these. Now, what I would like to point out is that in 1923, they're fitted with one 475 horsepower Napier line. That's a fairly quick turn of speed and increase. But neither one would I like to fly. Parnell is one of those companies which doesn't really get much mention about it. They produce some quite interesting little aircraft. The Panther, the Possum, the Pixie. I don't know. Pike, which was another one for carrier decks. Parnell pretty much get a name for producing very interesting experimental aircraft. They produced the G431 in 1930s, which was theoretically a day and night bomber as well as reconnaissance, torpedo, and dive bombing capability. It was powered by a Bristol Pegasus with a town end ring, and at that point had which was a 690 horsepower engine. It's another one of those aircraft which could have been instead of the Swordfish, but it wasn't to be. And frankly, I'm not surprised, because yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to the Swordfish. But no, both the Pintail and the Puffin don't go anywhere. And the reason they don't go anywhere is because they're produced to this specification, which is this lovely idea, and then it's found that, frankly, that's not a practical specification. Aircraft carriers are evolving, and the needs of the aircraft are evolving. So things change. It's kind of why the Fairey III goes through so many different variations. So that brings us to the Fairey Flycatcher. And it's one of my favourites of the entire thing from Fairey. Frankly, it's also one of the cutest aircraft ever produced. This is it serving off HMS Eagle in 1930, and yes, someone did point out that HMS Eagle does, as the archetypal cruiser carrier, does have certain style similarities to what the Invincible class would be with their through-deck cruisers, or rather the baby carriers, which the Royal Navy had in service for many, many years. And I would argue the reason for some of the similarities are because some of the similarities are a role in the fact that Eagle fitted that role rather well, as did Hermes in this period. I would have less to say about Argus in that role, but we'll leave that to one side. A crew of one. Yes, they were a single-seater fighter. Why? How come pre-radar, pre-everything, the Royal Navy has a single-seat fighter? When how many times have I said that the Royal Navy was thinking about long-range strike? Why would they want a single-seat fighter? Well, interceptor work. It's the same reason they get the Gladiator, and it's the same reason they're building the Sea Fang, which is a variation of the submarine. Is a submarine aircraft which does look like the Spitfire but has gull wings, and was actually being built to Royal Navy specifications. And if war hadn't broken out when it did, there would probably be a production line already in place producing them, and there would have been a right raw struggle with the Royal Air Force over whether or not they got their production of Spitfires or the Royal Navy got their production of Sea Fangs. Honestly, I have a feeling well, you'd have the Royal Navy, if they'd had the option, would have probably been producing Sea Fangs rather than Fulmars. Could have been interesting, as Fulmars had a longer range reconnaissance aircraft and quite useful for reconnaissance role, but if the Royal Navy had to pick between skewer production or Sea Fang production, they'd probably gone Sea Fang. And the reason is it was built to follow in the mold of the Fairey Flycatcher. A very fast rate of climb for its time, a 400 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Jaguar 4, which was reliable, 2-row air-cooled radial piston engine. Armstrong Siddeley are good at that. They produce some very, very good engines. And again, notice it's not a Bristol engine. Yes, Fairey, the company forever associated with Bristol because of what powers the Swordfish, do not use Bristols. Pretty much at all. This aircraft can also carry 4 20-pound bombs. Oh. And the thing it's really useful for, the Flycatcher? Dive bombing. In fact, one of the people I mentioned in the first video talks about it a lot because he is the test pilot who's in charge of testing it. And his name is Norman McMillan, and this is his account. As a freelance test pilot, I first flew Flycatchers on the 18th and 19th December 1923, when Vincent Nicol was ill. These were N9673 and N9676 and N9680. I flew my last and 93rd N9930 on the 1st of October 1930. All 3 prototypes had made their initial flights before I first flew Flycatchers, but subsequently, after modifications had been made, I developed and tested all 3. It's not unusual. You want to try and keep the same test pilot and the same chief designer the whole way through in the aircraft development because they are the best for continuity. They can tell you what problems have always been there. If you can't do that, then what you have to do is make sure that you have a very good crew of test pilots who share information and can communicate it well. This is why test pilots are often some of the most erudite pilots you will find, and also some of the most humble. Yes, they will have quite large egos. Trust me, you don't strap onto an aircraft which no one's ever flown before and try and put it through the edge of its capabilities if you don't have some healthy ego going on. But they will also tend to be far more self-reflective of those capabilities. It's one of the reasons why Eric Winkle Brown's books are so good, because he does have the ego and confidence to write that book, but he's also reflective enough and practiced enough in reflecting and looking at working out whether something was his fault or something was a problem with the aircraft, that he doesn't overpower his words with his ego. For our production runs, the Air Ministry required many special tests to be made in addition to the then standard contract half-hour flight tests before acceptance. They were chiefly checks and modifications and verifications of production standards by a performance evaluation of one or more aircraft selected at random from each batch. One particular test flight will serve to demonstrate the qualities of the Flycatcher. N9894 was allotted to a naval ship, which was commissioned to sail during January 1925. Thick fog grounded all aircraft for several days. Flycatchers had neither blind firing instruments nor radio, and no airfield could have been located visually or otherwise at the end of a half-hour flight. The Admiralty were pressing for delivery, but the Air Ministry would not accept the aircraft until the contractor's flight tests had been made. However, after the fog had persisted for almost a week, the Ministry said they would waive the half-hour contractual time and accept 9894 after any flight, short as might be, but it must be flown. I charged this Flycatcher in the thick fog and made a blind right-hand climbing turn away from the row of hangars. The swinging compass needle was no aid to orientation. When I judged that I had completed one spiral upward, I began to glide. I might easily have hit a tree or a hangar before seeing either obstacle. Nothing at all became visible until the instant for a tail-up touchdown on the grass just 2 minutes after takeoff. When my roll ended, I could not see the hangars or anything else. By that flight, N9894 holds the record for the shortest contractor's acceptance test flight. Only the superb handling qualities of Flycatcher made this blind flight a reasonable risk. In almost no contemporary or earlier aircraft would it have been reasonable, but the Flycatcher's free air controls were admirably coordinated. Stability in all axes was good. The long low aspect ratio fin offset to longitudinal axis neutralized yaw arising from propeller torsional airflow. Because the pilot sat near the center of gravity, he was not subject to disturbing beam moments during maneuvers. The Flycatcher had the response of the Sopwith Camel and the stability docility of the Pup, a combination of characteristics unusual at the time. And let's put it this way. Norman Macmillan would know those things. And what I also love is that picture is the picture here as well. Gives me slightly more detail about it. It says, a relatively free and easy days in the 1920s are exemplified in this Charles E. Brown study of a Flycatcher and the original HMS Eagle, courtesy of J.D. Orton. Still no one tell me what the destroyer is in the background. I'm going to have to hunt that down. Flycatchers were robustly built to a satisfactory safety factor, and FAA pilots handled their early aircraft with almost abandon until one, at Gosport, was found to be flying persistently left-wing low. The Air Ministry returned this early Flycatcher, powered by a Jaguar 2 engine, to Norfolk for the Fairey Company to investigate the cause. A wing rigging check found for everything correct, and inspection found no structural defect. When I discovered that this Flycatcher flew left wing low with power on and level with power off. So basically, this is pilots turned the engine off in midair to check how it's flying. All in a day's work for a test pilot. Viable at this time when aircraft could glide quite well. Not sure I'd want to do that in an F-35, but we'll leave that to one side. This led me to examine the tailplane, and there I found excessive movement. I had the tailplane mounting temporary brace tight with a piano wire, after which I found that left level flight was restored with power on and maintained with power off. It was now obvious that propeller torsional airflow, by warping the slack tailplane, had caused it to react as an aileron. The original Flycatcher tailplane mounting was then modified to prevent play from developing in the future, and the Ministry was informed that the defect had been eliminated. They requested dive tests with the modified mounting to be made and witnessed by their technical staff. This was the first British official requirement for a contractor to make dive tests, i.e. practice for dive bombing. Yes, despite the trouble the Royal Navy has with trying to get a dive bomber into service pre-World War II, they do actually have aircraft which are capable of dive bombing. The Skua, of course, is a fighter dive bomber, emphasis more on dive bomber than fighter. But the Flycatcher has been a dive bomber, and the Royal Navy does think about aircraft being involved in dive bombing. And we will be getting onto other aircraft which are involved in dive bombing. Those pictures all come from this book, and they show various things where the Flycatcher is hanging around HMS Glorious. You have this one taking off from Glorious in January 1930. That was, of course, making use of the forward lift, I think. And, of course, last aircraft able to operate off the slip flights from the air carriers. So basically, while they still had the lower taking off position, the Flycatcher was the last aircraft they had in service that could do that, which is rather cool. One of the interesting things about the Flycatcher is because it was quite such a small aircraft, it doesn't actually have to have folding wings. And it is tiny, relatively. It has a span of 29 feet and a length of 23 feet. So that's 8.8 meters by 7 meters. It's titchy. This was the first British official requirement for a contractor to make dive tests. Terminal velocity was not then a term in current use, but my full-power vertical dives has accelerated the Flycatcher close to, if it don't reach, its 282 miles per hour terminal velocity, a speed which was outside the dial range of the ASIs of that period, that's airspeed indicators. The tests they witnessed satisfied ministry experts. All Flycatcher tail units were similarly modified. There was no recurrent complaints, and diving of Flycatchers became a popular sport within the Fleet Air-Arm pilots. When the Fleet Air-Arm pilots demonstrated convergent dive bombing, the noise made by the Flycatcher was a part of the show. The Jaguar engines had short stub pipes from their exhaust valves and no silencer ring. Their exhaust roar when diving at full speed power was augmented by the sounds from the Fairey Reed propeller. This fixed-pitch duralium propeller was milled in one piece. Its thin solid blades were twisted near the roots to produce a designed pitch. It relied on centrifugal loading to aid blade stability. But in a full-power dive, propeller tip speed was close to and could even reach supersonic speed. And drag rising at these speeds caused tip flutter. The combination of sounds from the propeller shockwave and tip fluttering magnified the racket from the engines. Stresses arising from rapidly changing blade angles of attack during the pull-out from the dive introduced yet another form of propeller flutter that struck a different and final note in the diving cacophony of the Flycatcher. The Flycatcher was the Fleet Air-Arm standard and only fighter until the Hawk and Nimrod started to enter service in 1932. It served on everything. And it's no surprise that it's part of the cycle that goes through that after the Flycatcher goes, that the Royal Navy really steps up the ideas of having armored carriers, because it's pre-radar. And what they have been able to maintain with Courageous and Glorious and these flying off positions is 6 or 7, maximum of 8 Flycatchers could be stored forward between the forward lift and that little space. And if you have an alert, doesn't matter what's going on the main flight deck, they can take off. They can just be surged. So you literally have fighters stored out of the way of the sea, so they're protected, ready to go at a moment's notice. The pilots just need to jump in them. And if you are on high alert anyway, let's say you're taking part in exercises, etc., you would have some pilots sitting in there. Usually a couple of pilots sitting around in the space, comfortable, but not in their aircraft, but able to dive into their aircraft quickly and get away quickly. It's when you lose, your aircraft are too big to do that anymore. You don't have radar to give you a warning alert. That's when you start to think, hang on, if we're operating in the Mediterranean, or if we're operating the other side of the world and we don't have the infrastructure to support or rapidly build more aircraft carriers, that's when you start to think about armored flight decks, armored hangars. That's when you start to think about how you design your aircraft carrier to make it survive being hit. So the Fairey Flycatcher is incredibly important. And now we're on to the last aircraft. A two-seater reconnaissance aircraft, which is certainly compensating for something. What it's compensating for, I do not know, but that is a very, very long nose. I'm presuming it's trying to make the aircraft as streamlined and as fish-like as possible. Just really sort of going, you know, I'm going to be fish-like. I'm going to be svelte. But no, it isn't. It is just weird and looks like it's compensating for something. But it's the Fairey Fleetwing, and believe it or not, it doesn't get taken up into service much. It's one of many options considered at the time, and lots of different ideas are being put forward. But the Fleetwing, it loses out to its Blackburn counterpart. And also to the Fairey III, which is still knocking around. And frankly, they have something which works very well and doesn't look like it's compensated for something. So, hope you enjoyed this. As we speak, part 1 is already live, so I'm just going to finish this. If you do like it, please do subscribe. Or press the little bell down there. Maybe like. Maybe go join Discord. As I said earlier, if you're feeling generous, Patron. And thank you. Patron does come with the only merchandise that's currently available on this channel, for this channel, but I am working on some merchandise because people keep bringing it up, and I have ideas. Thankfully, Drac has more and, well, has more experience and has the ability to temper my ideas with reality. So they are being worked on. There will be things. And as far as I want t-shirts, and I want a t-shirt which, I can wear, as well as my constant rotation of other random ones. Hope you enjoyed, and hope you'll come back for part 3, and maybe even part 4. Thank you. Take care.